So the second No Kings rally happened a few days ago, and it resulted in some of the biggest turnout that we've seen, and it surpassed the turnout of the first No Kings rally. So that shows some real momentum when it comes to people being able to organize and mobilize for a special event for a couple of hours over the course of a Saturday. And that's a move in the right direction, and it certainly did a good job of countering the narrative that's been presented by all of the unhinged red hats who are calling this a pro Hamas, anti American, hate America rally. It's far from the truth. In fact, when you look at all of the rallies that happened across the country, and there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,600 to 3,200 rallies all over the country in every state across a number of cities. What you noticed was the clear and obvious lack of violence that happened in those rallies. And it wasn't for a lack of effort, because all sorts of red hats tried to instigate, and the instances of arrests that you hear about are typical red hats unable to handle their emotions, becoming unhinged and trying to incite riots as a way to do the bidding of their fearless leader. So, all in all, the fact that the second rally went off without a hitch and it had massive participation, it surpassed the previous rally. All of that is a net positive. But what did it actually accomplish? Depending on your perspective, it either accomplished a lot or it didn't accomplish anything. I land somewhere in the middle. What it did accomplish was that it demonstrated and proved to the people that were saying otherwise that the American people are fed up. And regardless of all of the fear mongering that has come from the right, people are still brave enough to take to the streets and organize in some minor way to show their resistance. So that is a net positive. People aren't hiding. And even though 5 to 7 million people were accounted for across these rallies, you have to take into account that the number of people that could have participated if they were able to is probably much larger than even that. Because think about the people who couldn't take time off. Think about the people who are in marginalized communities who aren't risking showing up and being at risk of being detained or arrested. Because let's face it, when the Gestapo is roaming the streets and their minions and stormtroopers are roaming the streets looking for easy targets, those of us with melanin are going to be those easy targets. So a lot of us choose not to participate. And rightfully so, because any resistance to this regime needs to be led by the majority population. And the majority population are the ones who are responsible for this regime being in charge in the first place. So you had all of that happen. And by and large, it's generally positive. When you take a closer look, you also know that there is a lot of room for growth in these rallies and the expansion into more direct action. So now that that rally is done, what next? There's a couple of things that you need to think about as we look at what happens after this. I think one of the first things that needs to be on the table, especially when considering the fact that this rally hasn't really resulted in any change of behavior, is that the next rally should be coordinated on a day that's going to yield maximum impact. So if we want to make sure that the people that are propping up this regime feel it in their pocketbooks, the next rally at a minimum should be on Black Friday, because this is the signature day that represents American consumerism. And what better opportunity to shut everything down than on Black Friday and you mobilize another rally in opposition to this regime. But that's just a starting point. And there's a reason why I'm calling these rallies versus protests. What you're seeing in these rallies is that you're seeing a very controlled environment. You're also seeing these rallies largely attended by the majority population. And because of those factors, you're seeing a very passive law enforcement presence. Think about how different the environment would be if you had more representation in these rallies. You would be getting a clearly different response from law enforcement. So when you think about the next rally, it needs to be aligned around a time frame that's going to have maximum impact on the people that are propping up the regime in charge. And that's why Black Friday makes a lot of sense. But we are at the point where we need to go beyond that. We've shown through these rallies that we have the ability to go ahead and organize on a massive scale. We need to take that to the next level. The second piece of this that we need to have on the table right now is a national strike. And by national strike, it means shutting everything down until our demands have been met. And that's the thing about this resistance and these rallies is that there have been no demands or no calls to action on the part of the regime to respond. And that's why you're seeing the regime respond the way that they have been responding. What did you see from the Republican Party? They just labeled it another hate America rally with no proof whatsoever. You saw the president drop an AI image of him flying a jet and dropping poop all over American citizens. So that is an example of art imitating life. This is a person who's been put back into power, and all he's done is crap on the American population. And now he's doing it via AI. That's what he thinks about everybody that he is supposed to be representing. What that tells you is that none of these people that are propping up this regime and enabling this regime are really taking anything seriously. And what that means is that the stakes need to be raised. Yes, we need to continue with these rallies, but that needs to also be supplemented with true protests and disruptions. There are hundreds and thousands of people that have been let go from the government. There are hundreds of thousands of farmers who are on the brink of losing their farms. There are hundreds of thousands of ranchers who are at risk of losing their ranches. There are all sorts of segments of the population that have been negatively impacted by this regime's actions. And what better way for them to mobilize and make the regime pay attention than to organize and clog up traffic and bring DC to a halt? When the French farmers weren't happy with what was happening within their country, they took their tractors and blocked traffic all across the country and brought France to a standstill. That's the type of response that needs to be seen and felt by the regime in order for them to change course. That's what an actual protest and civil disobedience and resistance needs to look like beyond these controlled rallies. That's step one. The second step that needs to be taken is a complete national strike. Shut everything down and consume as little as possible with the intent of hurting the billionaires and starving them of their revenue sources. Those three things, another rally on Black Friday, civil disobedience, blocking major strongholds, and particularly DC, bringing DC to a halt, and a national strike should be on the table as the next course of action when we're looking at how to move forward from this. The reality of it is that with the government shutdown, the regime is still operating under the same rules that it's always operated under. And while these protests might be interesting from an optics perspective, it hasn't changed anything in terms of how Republicans are responding or the regime is responding. What that means for everybody is that we need to continue reducing our spending. We need to escalate the stakes in the form of rallies and protests. We need to have a national strike, and we need to take civil disobedience to another level. A combination of sustained instances of these activities that's going to bring about change. And keep in mind, this regime is actively moving forward with their plans. And one of their plans is to starve the population. That's why they seem completely disinterested in reopening government, because they would rather have the most vulnerable people amongst us starve and die than actually govern. And let's not forget the historical context of what this regime is doing. When you look at the dictators across and throughout history, Stalin starved his people, Mao starved his people, Hitler starved his people, and you're seeing another instance where a wannabe dictator in the Oval Office is putting the things in place to create mass starvation and kill off a significant portion of the US population. When you have, and this is a playbook that you've seen across many different dictatorial regimes all across the world, and even some that are happening right now in the global south and in the Middle East. If you want to reduce the chances of a population fighting back against what you're doing, starve them. And that's the playbook that's been set in motion right now. The intent of this regime is to cause maximum casualties and maximum damage and make sure that everyone is too exhausted to fight. And that's why doing these rallies isn't going to be enough. It's got to be a sustained effort across a number of different tactics that's got to be utilized to bring them down. Because once the billionaires start feeling it in their bottom line, that's when change happens. And once change happens, we need to make sure that we don't forget any of the people that were involved in enabling this to happen as well. Let's be clear about what the future needs to look like. What we're looking at going forward, when this is over, is a decades-long project of de-Nazification of this country. And that includes everything in modern society. That includes prosecuting the people that were propping up this regime, prosecuting every single member of this regime, going after every single billionaire in this country, and making sure that especially those billionaires that helped fund this regime get stripped down to the studs and are left with nothing. And only after that can you start the process of actually building a society that takes care of everybody equally versus a society that's designed to only benefit the oligarchs. That's what needs to be done in the future. What needs to be done now is to escalate the stakes, raise the bar, and make sure that people can't discount what's happening and play it off as if it's business as usual, because it isn't business as usual. And that's the lesson that they haven't learned yet. And only when they start being inconvenienced in their own day-to-day lives will they start seeing how serious this is and make the necessary changes.